The fields of Bramblewood had always been peaceful. Endless acres of wheat stretched beneath the horizon, swaying in the wind, glowing gold in the late afternoon sun. For Gerald Marsh, the solitude of his land was a comfort, a place where the outside world couldn't touch him. He'd been working this farm for 30 years, and if there was one thing he knew better than anyone, it was his fields. Every dip in the terrain, every broken fence post, every patch of stubborn earth that refused to yield crops. It was home. But today something wasn't right. Gerald stood at the edge of his porch, leaning on the railing, a cold beer in hand as the sun dipped lower, casting the sky in hues of red and orange. It was the kind of evening he usually loved. But as his gaze drifted out toward the north field, he spotted something unusual. A tractor. At first glance it didn't seem odd, just another machine on the land. But Gerald hadn't left any equipment out there, and the strange thing was this one wasn't moving. It was parked right in the middle of the field, perfectly still. He squinted, trying to make out more details. The tractor was old, definitely not his. Dark, almost black, with rust along the edges of its body. But that wasn't the part that unnerved him. No, it was the cab. The glass of the tractor's cab was smeared with something dark, something that looked disturbingly like blood. Gerald blinked hard, as if trying to clear the image from his eyes. It had to be a trick of the light. Maybe some of the dirt kicked up from the recent storm had settled on the glass. He rubbed his eyes and looked again, but there it was, plain as day. The tractor stood motionless, the dark smear on its glass glaring back at him. He felt a chill creep up his spine, despite the warm evening air. There was no one else around for miles. No neighboring farms, no workers on his payroll this time of year. It was just him and the land. And that machine. Must be someone messing with me, Gerald muttered to himself, though his voice lacked conviction. He'd had a couple of beers earlier, maybe more than a couple. His mind was probably playing tricks on him. Yet the sight of that tractor, so out of place, so wrong, stuck with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned a deep purple. Gerald set his beer down and headed inside, forcing himself to dismiss the strange vision. He locked the door behind him and flipped on the lights in the kitchen, the hum of the old fridge the only sound in the house. But as the night settled in, he couldn't stop thinking about the tractor. It had been there, plain as day, yet there was no reason for it to be. Gerald had harvested that field weeks ago, and the machinery he used was all accounted for, parked neatly in the barn. After dinner, he tried to focus on the newspaper, but the words blurred together. His mind kept drifting back to that dark machine. Who would leave it there? None of the local farmers would have done something like that, not on his land. And even if they had, they wouldn't leave it looking like that. The thought of the smeared glass gnawed at him. He felt a tightening in his chest just thinking about it. Maybe I should just go check it out, he said out loud, though the idea made his stomach churn. Something deep inside told him not to, told him to leave it be, let the night pass, and maybe by morning it would all make sense. But another part of him, the part that had worked this land for decades, wouldn't let it go. Grabbing his flashlight, he stepped outside into the cool night air. The moon was bright overhead, casting long shadows across the field. From his porch, he could just make out the silhouette of the tractor, still sitting there, silent and unmoving. Gerald's hands tightened around the flashlight as he walked across the field, the long stalks of wheat brushing against his legs. The closer he got, the more he felt that something was wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his heart began to race. But he had to know. He had to see it up close. As he neared the machine, his flashlight beam hit the dark surface of the tractor. It was old, the paint chipped and rusted in places, but that wasn't what made his breath catch in his throat. The glass of the cab, smeared with red, thick and dried, was unmistakable now. It wasn't dirt. It was blood. Gerald stumbled back a step, his heart pounding. His breath came in short gasps as he shone the flashlight inside the cab, his hand trembling. The seats were torn, the fabric shredded as if something, or someone, had clawed at it. But there was no one inside. The tractor was completely empty. No keys in the ignition. No footprints around it. Nothing. He backed away slowly, the beam of his flashlight shaking as it swept across the ground. There were no tire tracks, no sign that the tractor had been driven here. It was as if it had just appeared in the middle of his field, a dark, blood-streaked phantom left to torment him. "What the hell?" Gerald whispered, his voice barely audible. He turned and hurried back toward the house, his pulse racing. Every shadow seemed to move in the corners of his vision, every rustle of the wheat sending a fresh wave of panic through him. By the time he reached the porch, he was out of breath, the flashlight clutched so tightly in his hand his knuckles were white. Inside, he locked the door behind him, bolting it for good measure, and slumped down at the kitchen table. His mind was spinning. He knew every inch of his land. There was no way that tractor could have been there without him noticing it earlier. And the blood? Who would do that? What? He tried to think rationally. Maybe someone had played a prank, or maybe some drifter had left it there and fled. But even as he ran through the possibilities, none of them made sense. He rubbed his eyes and stared out the window into the dark, where the tractor still sat, a hulking shadow in the distance. The more he thought about it, the more his mind turned over darker possibilities. Ghost stories he'd heard as a boy. Old superstitions whispered by his grandfather about cursed land and restless spirits. But he shook his head. That was nonsense. This was real, physical. It had to be. Still, sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of that blood-streaked glass filled his mind. The empty cab. The machine sitting silently in the field like it was waiting for something. Waiting for him. Gerald woke up with the dawn, his mind still thick with the haze of the restless night. He'd barely managed a few hours of sleep, the events of the previous evening gnawing at his thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that damn tractor, its blood-streaked glass, its shredded interior. But today was different. Today he was done being afraid. As the sun rose over the fields, casting long shadows across the wheat, Gerald stood on his porch, staring out toward the north field. The tractor was still there, as immovable as ever, sitting in the middle of his land like a dark sentinel. He'd half hoped it would be gone by morning, that maybe it was some figment of his imagination, something conjured up by a tired, overworked mind. But no, there it was, unmoving, waiting. He clenched his fists, feeling the anger bubbling up inside him. Whoever had done this, whoever thought it was funny to leave that monstrous thing on his land, they weren't going to get away with it. And if no one would come to move it, then he'd handle it himself. Gerald stormed into the shed, grabbing a heavy canister of gasoline and a blowtorch. If he couldn't move the tractor, he'd destroy it. No one left something like that on his property and expected him to sit by like some scared old man. He wasn't about to let some piece of junk, no matter how strange, keep him up at night. He made his way back to the field, marching through the golden sea of wheat. The sun was high now, but it did little to calm the sick feeling in his stomach. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching him from the woods or the edge of the property. But there was no one. The silence of the field was unnerving, broken only by the soft rustle of the wind. When he finally reached the tractor, it looked more ominous in the daylight than it had at night. The blood was real, that much he knew, dried and caked onto the glass. The cab was just as torn as it had been the night before, the seats slashed beyond repair, the smell of decay thick in the air. But there was still no sign of who, or what, had left it here. Without hesitating, Gerald unscrewed the cap on the gas canister and began dousing the tractor's wheels. The thick rubber of the tires absorbed the fuel, darkening as the liquid soaked in. He circled the machine, sloshing gasoline over every surface, his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. He just wanted it gone, burned to the ground. When he finished, he stepped back, sweat trickling down the side of his face despite the cool morning air. He flicked the switch on the blowtorch and a thin blue flame sparked to life. Gerald hesitated for only a second, his mind flashing back to the image of the blood on the glass, the terror he'd felt last night. But then he steeled himself. "Not on my land," he muttered through gritted teeth before lowering the flame to the tires. The fire caught instantly, flames roaring to life with an almost unnatural ferocity. Within seconds, the rubber tires were engulfed in flames, thick black smoke billowing into the sky. The heat hit him in waves, but Gerald didn't move. He watched as the fire climbed higher, crackling and spitting as it consumed the tires. The tractor seemed to shudder under the intensity of the blaze, metal creaking as the flames licked at its sides. He stood there for what felt like hours, watching the machine burn, the smoke rising like a dark column into the sky. Finally, when the flames began to die down, when there was nothing left but smoldering metal and charred rubber, he turned and walked back to the house. That night he allowed himself to relax. He ate dinner, sat in front of the TV, and for the first time since the whole ordeal had started, he felt some semblance of peace. It was over. The tractor was gone, reduced to ash in his field. There was no way anything could come back from that. But then, as darkness crept in, a thick fog began to roll over the land. At first, Gerald didn't think much of it. Fog was common this time of year. It settled in the low parts of the field, clinging to the earth like a blanket. But as the minutes passed, the fog grew denser, swallowing up everything in its path. From his porch, Gerald could barely see the road, let alone the fields. A familiar unease began to coil in his gut. He closed the curtains, trying to push the nagging sense of dread out of his mind. It was just fog. Nothing more. But no matter how much he tried to distract himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him again, waiting. By midnight, he was pacing the kitchen, unable to sleep. The house felt too quiet, the ticking of the clock too loud in the oppressive silence. Every time he passed the window, he couldn't resist peeking out, hoping to see nothing but the thick, harmless fog. But on his third pass, something caught his eye. A light. Faint at first, just a dull glow through the fog like a lantern swaying in the distance. Gerald's breath caught in his throat. He rushed to the window, heart pounding, eyes straining to make sense of the shape emerging from the mist. His blood ran cold as the outline of a tractor appeared, cutting through the fog like a specter. It couldn't be. He had destroyed it. He had watched it burn. Yet there it was, rolling slowly through the field, its wheels turning despite the melted rubber, its dark, hulking frame barely visible in the thick fog. And then he saw it again, the smear of blood on the glass, only this time it was fresher, dripping. Without thinking, Gerald grabbed his shotgun from the wall and burst out the front door. His heart hammered in his chest, fear battling with anger. He wasn't going to let this thing terrorize him anymore. He raced toward the tractor, his boots pounding against the wet earth, the fog closing in around him. The tractor moved slowly as if it were deliberately taunting him, its wheels grinding against the soil. But as he closed the distance, he could see the blood, thick, wet streaks that ran down the sides of the cab. His hands shook as he raised the shotgun, aiming for the tires. With a shout, he fired. The blast echoed across the field, and the left tire exploded in a shower of shredded rubber and steel. The tractor lurched to one side, the engine sputtering as it struggled to move. Gerald pumped another round into the shotgun and aimed at the remaining tire. "Stop!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. "Stop, goddamn you!" He fired again, and the second tire exploded, sending the tractor skidding to a halt in the mud. The fog swirled around the machine, and for a moment, everything went still. And then the doors of the cab creaked open. Gerald's breath hitched as a dark figure stepped out, its movements slow and unnatural, as if it were dragging itself from the depths of the earth. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, and its skin, if it could even be called that, was pale and rotted, hanging from its bones like wet rags. Its face. God, its face was a nightmare of torn flesh and exposed teeth, eyes sunken deep into its skull. It turned toward him, its hollow gaze locking onto his, and for the first time in his life, Gerald felt true, unbridled terror. He stumbled backward, the shotgun slipping from his hands, his legs shaking violently beneath him. The figure took a step forward, then another, its feet sinking into the mud as it came closer. Gerald tried to move, tried to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He was frozen, rooted to the spot as the thing advanced on him, its rotting hand outstretched. Before he could scream, something grabbed him from behind, cold, skeletal fingers wrapping around his neck, yanking him backward with unnatural strength. The world spun, the fog closed in, and everything went black. The last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him was the grinding roar of the tractor's engine, sputtering back to life.